Welcome to The Great Exchange, a podcast about examining the lies that we believe and exchanging them for God's truth. I'm your host, Brady, and joining me once again as a co-host is Pastor Mick Thornton. How are you doing today, Mick?
I'm good, Brady. How are you?
Good. So last time you joined us was back in September, and you had some really amazing truth to share. We got great feedback. You talked about seeing Jesus transform deep areas of our lives. He talked about the hidden rooms we keep in our hearts sometimes that we need to let community and really the gospel into. And people were really blown away by some of the depth of what you had to share. And it gave them a better context for moving forward in discipleship and becoming a whole person and dealing with their junk and really being able to apply the gospel to some dark areas. So now you're joining us again, and you are joining us from a laundry room, it appears, in Southern California. So there's a washer and dryer behind your little curtain there, because you are on a big year-long family adventure. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that adventure that you're on with your family?
Yeah, we found ourselves in this moment where we felt convinced that it was time for us to leave where we had been, the house and the community that we lived in for the last 15 years. And we did not feel at all settled as to where we were supposed to go. And piece by piece, it all just came together, and we sold our house, bought a giant fifth wheel camper, and headed off for parts unknown. So we've been at that for something like 4 months now. It's been amazing.
Awesome. So you've experienced, I think you're in Kansas, maybe Kentucky, Tennessee area. Now you're in California. And then you're going to be making your way up the coast and spend some time on a donkey farm outside Seattle, I hear. So
I hope so.
Yep. So we would love to have you. So today we are going to talk about, I think, a very important topic. We are going to talk about the emotional maturity of men, or lack thereof. And this isn't a man-bashing session, but we've both just seen in very ministry and ministry context, in very different ministry context, the sometimes lack of maturity emotionally that men have. And I think it's a cultural phenomenon. It's deeply rooted in many generations, and I've seen it affect people's discipleship. I've seen it affect their marriages, their parenting. And one area where I minister to with parents in LGBTQ issues is that the dads have such a hard time stepping into discipleship with their kids and their family, because discipleship means engaging in someone's emotions. Like if we are teaching the Word of God to our kids, then the next step is to apply it to their lives and apply it to their hearts. And so if we're going to apply it to their hearts in this act of discipleship, we have to understand what's going on in their hearts, which means engaging with their emotions and understanding how to apply the truth of God's words to their emotions. And I've seen dads really, really struggle with that. And so we would love to hear your thoughts on why you think that is, what we can do about it, how men can take a step forward in some emotional maturity so that we can better engage with our own emotions and the emotions of our wife and the emotions of our kids and the emotions of the people in the church that we're called to disciple and be a part of their journey. And so let's just open up this discussion with some thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely, Brady. This is it's a big conversation, right? Because when we're talking about the concept of emotional maturity, there's a lot that comes into that, and a lot of it from my perspective, a lot of it feels like shame. Like we're not having a conversation about men and emotional maturity because the world is so convinced that men are generally so emotionally mature. It's just the opposite of that, right?
Absolutely. And that's why I prefaced it with that this isn't a man bashing session, and so this isn't
Right.
to pile any type of shame onto anyone.
Agreed. And I think the first place we start to have that conversation well is to be honest about the fact that when we use the word maturity, that's not a pejorative term. Maturity is at its core a developmental term. So if I say to someone that they are immature, that means that there's a piece of them that is undeveloped. And I think that is precisely what we're talking about when we're talking about this cultural conversation regarding men and emotional connection and their abilities to connect to themselves, the world, and other people emotionally. I think we're really talking about a developmental conversation. I'm so convinced of that, in fact, that when I speak to groups, and particularly when I speak to groups of high school students, one of the questions that I very, very commonly ask is I say, okay, who here has ever heard the phrase, if you're going to cry, I'm going to give you something to cry about? And I stand back, and what percentage of hands do you think go up in the room when I ask that question?
I would think about all of them.
Yeah, 80%, 90%, 100% of the hands go up. Doesn't matter what group I'm talking to. Very rarely does it matter the ages involved, although I usually, like I said, do that with in middle school and high school conversations. That's really important to be honest about, because the reality of being a man in the United States of America is that we have been stewarded badly most of the time in terms of our own emotional growth and development. So when I enter into this conversation with you about emotional maturity and about the fact that many men struggle to be emotionally mature, for me, this is a care conversation. This is not a criticism conversation. Because what I see time and time again in my work with men and in my work with youth is I see people who have been, from literally the time they were in diapers, have been given bad advice for how to develop emotionally, and oftentimes have been punished for their own emotional experience. And that's a real problem. So as we talk about this conversation about emotional maturity in men, I think it's very important that we understand that what we're really having is we're having a developmental conversation. And one of the things that we have to do is we have to be able to care about ourselves, and we have to care about other people exactly where they're at. And the reality is that a lot of people are not well developed in terms of their own emotional experience, and there are a whole lot of reasons for that.
Absolutely. What ways did you see this coming out? You spent so many years as a pastor, and so what ways did you see this coming out in, just pastoral ministry? I don't want you to obviously throw anyone under the bus, but what barriers were put in place because of this culture of men not being fully developed when it comes to emotional maturity, and how did that affect the church world and ministry to individuals and families?
Sure. So ministry, probably above all things, right? To be done well, it's a whole-bodied experience. It's a whole self experience. And when we're talking about trying to serve well in ministry, and by the way, when I say ministry, I'm talking about just our entire discipleship lives. I would include our family connections in that, probably above all other things. But when we're talking about ministering well in the world, that is the place where our deficiencies, our developmental areas of lacking, are going to become the most apparent. And I think that one of the ways that we see that in church context over and over and over again is there are kinds of ministry in the church that we don't do. that we can't do. And very often what that looks like is we can't walk honestly with people in the midst of their suffering. I can bring you a casserole if you're dying of cancer, and that's not unimportant, right? But if your suffering is not within a fairly narrow bandwidth, right? It's very, very difficult for us to walk honestly with you. Like I can take you to a weekend conference if you're struggling in your marriage, right? But if your marriage struggles for 5, 10, 15 years, right? It's much, much harder for me to just walk honestly with you in the midst of that. I feel like one of the reasons why that is true is because it requires a degree of emotional connection that is often very, very hard for us. So I'll tell you a story about early on in my experience in pastoral ministry. It was just a year or two in Nebraska in this case, because that's where I pastored, and somebody took me to a Husker football game. So Nebraska Cornhusker football game, which is like an event. Like you get within a mile of the stadium on game day, and it's just like there's just like this energy in the air. Like it's a powerful kind of thing, right? And we get there and we sit with, I don't even know how many, I mean, this packed stadium full of people, and there are highs and there are lows, and people cheer and they cry out in frustration, and they do all of this stuff together. And it was without a doubt the largest worship experience that I've ever participated in the state of Nebraska. Part of that is another podcast, right? Part of that is another conversation. But
absolutely, I'm looking forward to that one, because I've always talked about sports and idolatry, and growing up in Nebraska and the Huskers, it's like this is the biggest worship service in the state.
Right. The other side of that conversation, though, is the thing that I think keeps drawing us back to Husker Stadium or to our TVs on Sundays or whatever sports we particularly enjoy. Because one of the things I think that is true for many men is that that's been the only realm of our entire life experience where we could be emotional and still be okay. Most men that I work with in day-to-day life that I live my life alongside of are comfortable in two emotional experiences. They're comfortable being angry, and they're comfortable being fine. Right?
Wow.
I'm mad, I'm fine. In the sporting arena, for whatever reason, we can be mad, we can be sad, we can be afraid, we can be excited, we can have joy, we can have sorrow, we can feel injustice and pain and all of it, right? And I think that's really, I think, the thing that draws us back to the arena time and time again, is just that it's a place where we can be alive. And my opinion, going back to sort of the root of this conversation, when you'd ask me how do I see lack of emotional development playing out in ministry context, I think that's one of the reasons why many churches feel kind of dead, quite frankly.
There's not life happening there if there's not emotion happening.
Right. If you have a decades-long pattern of creating space where people can only show up okay, where my options are to show up at church happy, ready to shake a few hands and sing a few songs, or not show up at all, then the hollowness of that consumes you over time. So I think that many of the ways that we see that emotional void play out are in the things that aren't present as much as the things that are present. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
I think it plays out heavily. In the ways that we preach. I think that one of the reasons why very teaching heavy preaching styles are sought out and sometimes preferred within certain subsets of the church is because there's no emotion in that. Because I can reduce the glory of God to a collection of factoids, and that's a way for me to be able to interact with God as He isn't really, as me not being me really.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a designed form of insincerity and inauthenticity, in my opinion, that we crave sometimes.
And so people can show up and still have the mask on and not have that mask challenged or threatened or be pushed outside their comfort zone, all while seeking the image of godliness because of the preaching and the things that they can hold on to and value in church without an emotional capacity to it.
Sure. And I think it's very important to be honest about the fact that most men don't wake up in the morning feeling a whole bunch of feelings and bed them down, right? That we've all developed lots and lots of defense mechanisms that whose explicit purpose, by the way, the explicit purpose of these defense mechanisms is to not feel how we're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest to you that if en masse men suddenly became absolutely comfortable feeling whatever emotions they were feeling, that tomorrow the entire pornography industry would collapse, for example. I would suggest to you that if en masse men showed up tomorrow 100% comfortable feeling whatever they were feeling, I would suggest to you that the entire alcohol industry would collapse tomorrow. That any kind of narcotic industry, mood-altering narcotic industry, would collapse tomorrow. The betting industry, the gambling industry, would collapse tomorrow. I really believe that we spend our lives, and oftentimes in ways that we find ourselves to be terribly, terribly ashamed of, doing things that at root, if we can really peel back the layers and understand what's going on, that we do as ways to not feel how we're feeling. And that is, to me, the definition of what I would call, I don't often use the term emotional maturity or emotional immaturity, but that would be the definition for me of emotional immaturity. That would be where we are constantly substituting in our lives more and more ways to sort of continue forward, or at least continue some direction, while not having to feel what we feel.
How do you see these issues affecting families? And obviously some of it's obvious. If you're going to, pornography, alcohol, some of those, consequences are obvious on what it could do to our family. But at a deeper, more personal level, what do you see happening within our American families when you don't have a dad in the house who is fully emotionally present, maybe physically present, and maybe a hard worker, earns a paycheck, the family's well provided for. And so many times I think that we mistakenly think that that's the dad's only job, is to provide well for the family. And obviously that's important. We need more dads to do that. But, and then we, think that, well, it's the mom's job to do that emotional stuff. And the dad doesn't emotionally engage with the kids. And what consequences do you see that having in our families?
Yeah. First off, I would say from my perspective, I don't think there's a dad in America that fully emotionally engages in his family. I think that to live our lives and with that degree of authenticity, that degree of vulnerability is a penultimate experience that, God willing, we will experience in the kingdom. I think that what we find we find ourselves all on this spectrum of emotional development, and it tends to be the case that our experience culturally is that we tend to be on the bottom end of that spectrum, and I would argue that what happens when we find ourselves on the bottom end of that spectrum are a series of imbalances. So one imbalance you described, where oftentimes we ask, if in a two-parent household, we ask the mom to essentially be emotional enough for everybody. So there's this over functioning that can happen. Another thing that often happens is if you're going to cry, I'm going to give you something to cry about speech, where we punish our children out of their own emotional experience, not because it's bad for them to experience life and to grow emotionally, but because we can't deal with it. because
we don't
it,
want to engage,
right.
so we want to silence what's going on.
Right. It requires something of us that we either can't or don't know how to give. So one of the ways that we manage that is we punish ourselves, we punish our children, we punish our spouses for having needs that are completely legitimate. So I think that is one of the ways that we sort of create and manage that imbalance. I think and I think the end result of all of that is perpetuation, right? That we then raise our children as people who have never experienced emotional wholeness, who've never seen somebody be angry and just be angry, right? Be angry and not do something that is hurtful, abusive, unkind. Possibly we raise our children in a situation where they have never been, they were never able to cry. When maybe there was a death in the family, different things. I don't know how many stories I've heard from people about the most horrific life situations that they experienced in their childhood, and one of the things that just sort of sealed that whole experience into darkness is then starting the very next day, it was never spoken of again, right? We and again, I describe all of these things as defense mechanisms. We find ways to make life work even when we don't work. And those imbalances affect us. They affect, everybody in the room, and they most especially affect our children, because as much as we like to talk about kids as though they are resilient, that's not true. The reality is not that kids are resilient. The reality is that kids are malleable, that they are inherently formable. And we're deeply forming them by just us being us and managing life however we do.
So many times when I hear parents or adults who have kids who have gone through a tragic event, like, oh, they're doing great, kids are so resilient. And it's like, no, I think that this is going to show up later in life, because they look fine on the surface, but they haven't dealt with the emotional aspect underneath the surface. So this is going to come out in their marriage and their parenting and what they're seeking in relationships and making bad decisions and addiction issues. And so you might look at your 7-year-old and think, oh, they're resilient, they're fine, but it's going to boil to the surface in unhealthy decisions and all kinds of defense mechanisms later on in life.
That's very, very often the case. I think it's important just to take a moment's pause as we consider that very real possibility, because for many of us, I think for me and for many people whom I've served, these kind of conversations wake up a paralyzing sort of fear.
Yes.
Because what we hear is that we are deficient, and our deficiencies are in advance wrecking the lives of our children. And I don't exactly believe that, and I know you don't exactly believe that either, which is why I want to just take a moment as we sit in
something we're not saying.
Right. I want to sit in this messy space for just a second, which is really hard, because that requires us to sit in an emotional mess for just a second, because we've just walked into a space that is scary, that is shameful, that is guilt inducing, that comes with lots of emotional stuff that I don't know about you, but I don't particularly love to feel. So let's just sit here for a minute in the reality of what it looks like to be parents who do not have what it takes to raise our children into the lives that we so desperately hope for them. Because I believe that from here, if we can just sit in that what we can find is tremendous hope. Now, what we normally do is we won't sit here. We won't be here for 2 seconds, right? We will either manage this space through judgment, through, comparing ourselves to whoever else who is worse than us. We'll bring in blame. We'll bring in all these things, or we'll manage through denial. We'll manage through, any number of things. But if we can sit in that moment I think from here we begin to see something really, really beautiful, because from here what we get to see is the gospel. Because the truth is that if I were the person that people tend to think that I am, because of the whole Pastor Mick thing, if I were whole and functioning in wholeness in the way that people tend to think that I do, honestly, I'm not sure that the gospel would be that important to me on a daily basis. I think that the gospel would be important to me in the past tense sense, in that I have come to faith in Jesus. And I think it would be important to me in the future sense, in that I am going to be with Jesus forever. But in my day-to-day experience, I'm not sure that it would be that big a deal to me. But from here, recognizing that, within several feet of where I sit, because my whole life happens in like a 43-foot fifth wheel now, that realizing that within several feet of where I sit, there are people for whom I would die. My wife, my children. There are people who are desperately dependent on me to offer them a certain kind of experience as a father, as a husband. And I don't got it. I mean, in some ways that are important, I don't got it. From there, Jesus becomes very important to me today. Because from Jesus, I understand grace. I understand that not only is there hope for them, that there's hope for me, that in this broken moment, the Spirit of God is living, active, powerful, and at work. And I think those things are really important, because those are our ways out. Because one of the things that came for me for many, many years of my life walking as a particularly emotionally stunted person, one of my experiences in that was an experience of tremendous worthlessness and guilt and shame. And the last 10 years or so, especially the last 3 years, have been very much for me about the experience of walking more and more in the truth of who I am, and being able to experience the fullness of life, which means being able to be, among other things, an emotionally developed person. And while on the one hand, I absolutely believe that I'm a better husband because of that, I'm a better father because of that, I'm better at everything I do because of that, and I'm more whole in my experience because of that. It is also true that in those years where that was not true for me, the Spirit of God was at work in me still. Like seeds were being planted still. And my hope is that as somebody else listens to this conversation right now, and maybe they're stinging, and maybe they're pretty far on the front end of that, right? Maybe they're the dad who tells their kids, if you're going to cry, I'm going to give you something to cry about, because they can't deal, right? Because they're tired, because they're worn out, because they don't know what to say, because they don't know what to do, because of all of it. My hope is that if that dad is listening right now, if that husband is listening right now, for that matter, if that high school student who's not a dad or a husband yet is listening right now, but is from that place where they just don't feel super awake emotionally, my hope is that what you feel in this conversation is hope. That the reason we're having this conversation isn't just to acknowledge the difficulty of the way things are, but because there's a way forward from here, man, and it includes you. That if I have the prospect of continuing to walk more and more every day into a place of emotional fullness, that so does everybody else. And I think it's really important that we realize that the place that we start is not from the mountaintop. We don't start from these moments where we're like, wow, I guess I just got this thing all sorted out, so we're good. Mm-hmm. The place we start is exactly in that mucky place that you mentioned a moment ago, where we are in many ways failing the people we love the most, where we are in many ways not living truly to the fullness of what God has called us to be.
Wow, that's heavy, but also hopeful that the gospel can sustain us through this moment and help us move forward with hope. And I love that message that this isn't shame, this is hope, that things can be different. And that as we are developing, Christ is still at work and sustaining our kids and sustaining us as a husband and father and a man and a brother and whatever role we're playing right now, is that that Christ will sustain us and them and give us day by day, moment by moment, hope to allow us to take down the defenses, take down the walls, and actually sit and feel.
Can I share with you a little bit of my process that helps me?
Absolutely.
To continue
Love to hear it.
to just experience and process my life, and helps me to grow in my own emotional development. So I had to get really good with 4 words. I'm a word person. I like words. I've got a large vocabulary and I use it in various contexts. But when it came to emotions, I had to really snuggle up to 4 words. And those words were mad, glad, sad, and afraid. Because the reality is, of those 4 core human experiences, there was only one that I was willing to allow myself to really experience. The other 3, I felt like my job was to escape from.
Mm-hmm.
The truth is, as
a leader of your household and the leader of a church and a leader in this, leader in that, there's expectations placed on us that's the only emotion we're allowed to, the only state we're allowed to be in.
Absolutely. That that it's your job to be okay all the time, something like that, which is totally unrealistic. What I learned was that it's possible to be sad and okay. It's possible to be mad and okay. It's possible to be afraid and okay. And most importantly of all, it's okay to not be okay. It's okay that there are days that I need to be able to reach out to you, Brady Cohn, and be like, dude, not okay, man. Mm-hmm. And it's okay that there are days where you need to reach out to me and be like, dude, not okay today. That we get to walk in that together and have this transformative experience in which not only do we both walk out more okay, but we also both walk out closer together and more connected.
Yes.
Because I would argue that one of my primary defense mechanisms against my own emotional development, and one of the primary defense mechanisms that I see in many, many other men, is that of isolation. That one of the ways that we live life as people who can't experience life fully is we don't experience life at all. We keep you over there and me over here. And you hear my dog barking in the microphone right now. How's that for creating perfect podcasting space, right?
The joys
but we
of
do.
camper living.
That's right. So, but we do. We isolate ourselves because we're afraid of what would happen if you saw me afraid, if you saw me sad, if you saw me not okay. But so I take those 4 words and I attempt to use them regularly in my life. So here's how this works. First of all, I have to use them with me because all of my experience starts from right here. I have no idea what it looks like to look the world through Brady's eyes, through anybody else's eyes, right? It all starts from right here. So I have to use those experiences with me and ask the question, what is this, right? One of the things that I think is important is that those words have definitions. They're just like other words, right? The word car has a definition. The word bicycle has a definition. The word sad has a definition. For example, I think that the definition of sadness is when you lose something that's important to you. I think that's what sadness is. I think that's the reason why grief for me, especially grief in death, is a very, very intense and ultimate kind of sadness. I believe that gladness is just the experience of things being okay. Like saying, you know what, this is right. This is how things ought to be. I believe that fear the definition of fear is the way that our body says to us that something bad might happen, right? It's fear tends to be very, very future focused, or it tends to lock us into very much a very particular experience of some kind of not good thing, right? And I think that the definition of anger, and this is really important because as men, we tend to do anger. We don't necessarily do it out loud, depending on the way we've been conditioned to be angry. All anger is the emotion that says something is not okay. And that's very important because it turns out from those definitional perspectives, guess what? Anger, not a bad thing. Sadness, not a bad thing. Fear, not a bad thing. They're windows of human experience. They're just things that we are designed by God to experience. So what I've learned to do is to take those words, use them often in my life, and then look for their roots.
I think that when it comes to experiencing anger, as men, we have a tendency to make it all about outside circumstances. I'm angry at this, I'm angry at that, or this is the cause of my anger. If my kid just did this better, if my wife did this better, if my coworkers did this better, that the feelings inside of me are always from something outside of me, instead of being able to sit in a place where this is something inside of me that I need to engage with, that the root of it is really inside of me. It's my circumstances that are revealing it, but the feelings are something inside of me.
Absolutely. And I think starting from that perspective changes the whole conversation, because then I can just be honest about my own experience. First of all, with myself, like I said, because I think you have to start there. The second place we have to be honest with our experience is with God. And that's really hard for those of us who were told, if you don't have anything good to say, don't say anything at all. That whole speech, right? To be honest with God can be so hard. But then if you go back to the Psalms, you find that 2/3 of the Psalms are what are called Psalms of Lament. And all that means is they are songs, they are expressions of difficult emotional experience back to God. It's people saying, hey, God, I thought you were going to be there for me, and you weren't. Hey, God, I thought things were supposed to go this way because you're you, but they don't. Those kind of conversations are everywhere. And guess what? For the most part, guess who they're written by? Men, interestingly enough.
And it's so interesting that we have the culture of, a lack of emotional development amongst men, especially in the church. We can't expect the world to have a biblical foundation of anything, but in the church, we should be seeking a biblical foundation and of how we live and where our hearts are at. And the Bible is full of men showing emotion. It's like Jesus wept.
It is.
That the Psalms are full of men showing emotion and lamenting. And so we have to look at that, and we should be able to embrace it, that this is a part of our discipleship. This isn't some worldly concept. This is becoming who Christ desires us to be. And so, as we kind of run out of time here today, let's just leave with what are a couple of thoughts on the biblical blueprint of how we can become a more whole person from the gospel, because we develop that area like we see happening in Scripture and like we see Jesus displaying for us. How can we become more whole in this area of our life?
Absolutely. I think that we walk in the example of Jesus and in the example of Scripture. What we see in the life of Jesus and what we see in the example of Scripture at large is, number one, we see people experiencing life entirely. We see people experiencing life cognitively. We see people experiencing life spiritually. We see people experiencing life emotionally. It's happening, right? We see people expressing that emotional experience negatively, and we see them expressing it positively, but we see it happening. So we have to be honest about the fact that we are emotional. It's not a problem. It's not a defect. It's a design by God. It's a feature, not a bug. We're designed to be emotional, okay? Number two, we've got to be able to to own that emotionality ourselves. Like I said, those words, mad, sad, glad, and afraid, help me do that. I think that expressing those things to ourselves, expressing those to God, and then when it comes to experientially expressing those back and forth to each other, speaking with emotion words to our wives, speaking with emotion words to our children, that's how we break the pattern. One thing I'm happy to say, my kids know when I'm angry, and it's not because I hurt them when I'm angry. It's because I say I'm angry. You know, I think that is how we create a different story, is by giving ourselves permission to be all of those things together. I love the biblical admonition to be angry, but do not sin.
Yes.
I think that's particularly important in this conversation, because that tells us, number one, anger is not a sin. Number two, believe it or not, we should do it. And number three, how we emotionally, or how we express it, becomes very important. I think that in those spaces, what we find is we find a pattern for life that is not only better, it's doable. Like, as men in our culture, carrying all of the stuff that we carry, we can mature. We can develop emotionally. We can do it if nobody's around to help us, and we can do it a lot better if we're around to help each other. I actually designed an app recently that is expressly for this purpose. It's called the Good Talk app. So if you go to Apple Store or Google Play, somewhere like that, type in the Google app the Good Talk app and Mick Thornton. All it is just a quick journaling app where you can talk through your mad, sad, glad, and afraid, figure out what that's about for you. And if you want to, you can even share it back and forth with somebody so you can have that conversation together. These are the ways that I think that we move forward in this conversation in a way that changes our lives, changes the fabric of our families, changes the fabric of the church, and ultimately helps us walk in the truth of the gospel every day.
Awesome. Mick, with that said, I think that I should close us in some prayer and just pray for the people who hear this. Lord, I thank you so much for Mick and his wisdom and what you've taught him. I thank you that he speaks life and truth, and that you have developed him in ways that so many of us have struggled to develop. And what I pray for every person listening to this today, especially the men, that you can help them rest in your grace, help them not see the need for more walls because of shame and guilt, but help them see hope and help them see freedom, help them see that they can experience life more fully and that they can rest in the gospel on a daily basis. And on a daily basis, the gospel is sufficient for them to do in them and through them and for them what they could never do on their own. So I pray that we can develop healthier men, healthier families, healthier churches, and that comes from us willing to engage in the hard work and the reality, and be able to just sit in the moment and understand where we're at and what we need to do to move forward. Pray these things in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Brady.
Thank you so much, Mick. Appreciate you, and hopefully you make it up this way. And maybe when you come up here, we'll do one of these live together, actually in the same room, maybe some donkeys in the background, and we can continue to share some of your wisdom.
I hope so. Thank you for the time.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on The Great Exchange. We pray that as you go throughout your week, you can examine the lies that you've believed and exchange them for God's truth. Be sure to check out the website, thegreatexchangepodcast.com, calibrateministries.com. Share this episode with some of your friends. Check out the website to see how you can contribute to the ministry. We thank you for joining us and hope to see you next week.